Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Professor Hall, and today we are going to be talking about Amy Tan's Joy Luck Club. This is the last lecture in our series, so if you haven't already, I recommend that you go back and watch the first 3 lectures. So in the first lecture, I gave a summary, kind of looking at the structure of the book and talking about all of the narrators and the pairs of mothers and daughters. And then in the second lecture, I gave some historical background about the setting of the book, some of those details that aren't in the story itself, but are kind of helpful to know, to have a richer experience when you're reading it. The third lecture, I talked about some of the themes in the novel. And then today, what we're going to be doing is looking at the book and how it fits into the literary tradition or literary movement of postmodernism. So there are a number of features of postmodernism that we talked about at the beginning of the term. One of them that we can see in this book is intertextuality. So that means that texts reflect or play upon or change other texts. So for example, the young adult book, Ella Enchanted, or the kids' book, Ella Enchanted, that's a play on the traditional story of Cinderella, right? Or Ulysses by James Joyce is a retelling of the Odyssey by Homer. So in this book, we don't have a precise text that the book plays upon, but it does look at and kind of rework for contemporary audiences the idea of the Chinese talk story. Chinese oral traditions are really woven into every woman's story. And I talked before about some of the superstitions that are there, the ways that they have this shifting idea of memory, which we'll talk about more in a minute. All of those kind of come together in each person's story, whether it is one of the mothers or whether it is one of the daughters, because the daughters have been influenced, of course, by this culture that they've grown up in. Another facet of postmodernism that we can see in this book is the idea of philosophical pluralism. So pluralism meaning there's more than one. Philosophically, pluralism says that truth is subjective. Whether or not you believe that, if you believe in absolute truth, that's okay. But pluralism in this sense says that there's no one truth. In other words, there's no one way of truly looking at an event or situation. And of course, we get that in this book because we have so many narrators who are talking about their experiences. So in some ways, if we look at what the mothers went through during the Second Sino-Japanese War, we have all of their diverse experiences during that war, right? In other times, we have a mother and a daughter looking at the same situation, and sometimes even one of the other characters looking at the same situation from a different perspective. So if you look at Waverly, for example, when she is involved in the chess tournaments, her mother has a much different perspective on this than she does, and we get both of their viewpoints on the story. And then, of course, we also have Jing Mei, who is being kind of pushed by her own mother to be a child prodigy, in part because of the success that Waverly has had with being a chess prodigy. So it's kind of interesting to see this one event from 3 different perspectives and how it affects these 3 different people. Political pluralism is also a feature of this book. Political pluralism basically says that in a society where you have people of various cultural backgrounds, multiple people groups and entities keep their traditions and their culture, but they share political power. So in a sense, the idea that we should have better representation of minority groups or of formerly oppressed voices in literature or on the screen The Black Lives Matter movement would be another example of political pluralism. And I think that some people would kind of just leave it at that, like, oh, this is an Asian American writing a book. But Amy Tan has really been clear that she is not the representative for all of Chinese Americans, right? That sometimes happens with tokenism, where one person is sort of like meant to represent everybody. That's not what she's trying to do here. But I think more importantly, again, with this experimentation of form, another facet of postmodern literature, the diverse narrative voices that we get really show that even among Chinese Americans, there is no one perspective. And that, to me, is a really important point that she's making in this book. You have 8 different women. You have 7 of those women telling stories. Of course, June tells her story and her mother's. We also get her father telling part of her mother's story, right? And they're all very different. They've all had very different experiences. Now, they have some commonalities because they're friends and they think of themselves almost as a family of their own creation, right? But it is quite important to the author that she did not have just one person telling all of these stories. So we get that the voices that are here represent a number of different viewpoints, and hopefully the reader can see that there's many more different viewpoints outside of this. So another common feature of, going back to the narration, another common feature of postmodern literature is the unreliable narrator. Now, in many books, a narrator is unreliable for a couple primary reasons. They are insane. They are a child or a fool, so they don't know everything that's going on. They might be lying and hiding something. There's about, I think there's 4 or 5 reasons why people might be unreliable. Here, it isn't a case that the narrators are untrustworthy, or that they're not specifically lying to the audience, right? They're also clearly not insane. These are sane, rational people. I think the unreliability comes into play when we look at memory. In many of these stories, the women talking were children. So we have memories from when they were 6, when they were 4, a couple of them when they're about 10, 11, 12, right? So the idea here really isn't so much to question narrators, but again, looking at philosophical pluralism and how truth can be subjective. I think that the author is asking, how do we rely on memory? How is memory kind of elusive and hard to pin down? Do we remember an event one way one day and then think about it a different way a different day? So for example, if you are thinking about a breakup, one day you might think back and think, oh, but this person was so lovely and I remember when we went on this trip together. And another day you might think about, oh, and that person was a nightmare to be with and that's why we broke up. And I remember when we took this trip and we argued the whole time. So it's like different ways of seeing the same event, even in your own mind, right? And in some sense, I think that's one of the reasons that these other folk tales and superstitions are kind of painted or woven through these stories. Can our memories be fully trusted? But also, how do we pass on these memories to others? And do we feel reliable enough to tell our children about our experiences? And in this book, the answer very often is no. I read you that excerpt the other day about, I forget now who said it, but she says, I taught my daughter how to be American and how to know that when you are in America, it doesn't matter where you start. If you're born poor, you don't have to stay poor. So I taught her how to be an American, but I didn't tell her about Chinese ways of thinking and how I feel like that way of thinking is better. So it is quite I don't want to use the word again, but it's quite an elusive concept, right? To talk about how we remember things and then also how we communicate those memories to others. So in that sense, we have unreliable narrators because they are trying to fully express themselves and they're kind of unable to, in part because of those generational differences, those cultural differences that we have. So the idea of diversity here, again, with pluralism, it's not just one character, but it's many different characters. And I will say, too, that I think that this book sits at a point where we're moving a little bit away from postmodernism and into contemporary literature. I talked about this before, but really when with the internet, which kind of blew up a little bit after this book. This book was published in 1989. But with the internet, we have a much more diverse literary landscape. And there are other features of contemporary literature that I think are a little bit different than postmodern. But there's a lot of critics who argue that we're still in postmodernism, and there's some that argue that we've moved away from it. But I will say that beyond just being a postmodern book, this story really is deeper and more rich than just an exercise in postmodernism of having different narrators tell their stories just kind of for the sake of them telling their stories, which I think some postmodern books kind of fall into that trap. They're a little bit more about the gimmick than they are about the actual story. The book itself shows those tensions between the old and the new, being pulled between traditions of China and the new American way of life. It shows the immigrant experience, and really also the second generation experience, which is something that hadn't, or many times it hadn't been voiced up until this point. But also, the author is very clear that she's not representing one specific ethnic group. She's not trying to write for all Asian Americans. These really are stories that are personal to her, and there is fiction here, but it is blended a little bit with memoir almost and nonfiction. So Tan's grandmother was also named Jing Mei, and she was forced to become the concubine of a wealthy man. While married, she received very cruel treatment at the hands of his other wives and eventually ended up committing suicide. Her daughter Daisy, who's Amy Tan's mother, was then raised by relatives, and in China also was married to a cruel man. So when she left China, she remarried in the United States. And after her father's death, Amy Tan learned that this marriage, her mother's first marriage, existed. So she realized that her mother had been married before, and then she discovered that her mother had also left behind 3 daughters in China. So Amy Tan has talked previously about these things. She also talked about the fact that she and her mother had conflict very often, and she really only learned of her mother's struggles gradually as she got older. So in some sense, this book really, I think, is a way of working through some of those issues and giving paying homage to the family that she grew up in, to the culture that she was surrounded by, and really kind of, again, weaving, this idea of weaving, I think it's really important in this book, weaving together her memories with these beautiful fictional narratives. So we have this beautiful blend of her actual experiences alongside the fiction. So I think that the other thing too is that it isn't just a story aimed at people who are Asian Americans or aimed at people who are minority groups. There's a lot here about women, feminism being another feature of postmodernist books. I talked before a little bit about marriage and the relationships between women, the relationships between men and women, the gender role expectations that are here. But over and above that, there are universal themes that really anybody can relate to. Things about family and love and marriage and identity that any reader can identify with. And I think at any point someone has had a struggle with their parent or guardian. At any point someone has been trying to explain a memory to someone and they're just not getting it because they haven't had your experience, right? So to me, I think it's a fascinating book, and I love this book because it really is a narratively diverse novel with diverse characters from different perspectives, different ages, different periods of time. Some of these stories are told and it's, around 1915. Other stories are told and it's 1989. So it spans quite a long period of time. And yet, at the same time, it's very relatable. And to me, that's what makes a book great, when it has a specific message, but also a universal one. And so I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you kind of understand where it fits in better with these literary movements. And if you're in my class, I can't wait to see your thoughts on this book. I'm really excited to share it with you. Thanks, everybody.